Five, four, three, two, one.
Okay, hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa. It's time for the Armistice Inquisition yet again, episode 183 on Sunday the 9th of May. I'm Amish Phil.
I'm Irish Ben.
I'm Irish Matt.
And tonight's returning guest is a YouTuber and a purveyor of independent, fact-focused, non-ideological content on YouTube, Mallen Baker. How are you doing, Mallen?
I'm doing all right. Great to be here again.
I nearly nailed your catchphrase there.
You nearly did.
It's pretty important, though, what you're doing, because this is severely lacking in the current cultural paradigm. Would you not agree?
Well, I mean, yes, we live in polarised times, and the trouble is that, of course, it's easier to get views by playing to the polarisation, because the whole YouTube mechanism and Facebook and everything else as well, to be fair, is set up to try to generate clicks and to try to keep you on the sites, and it does that more easily by encouraging you to go deeper and deeper into rabbit holes than it does for you to stand slightly back and take an objective view. So all of the incentives push the other way. And I sort of had to decide that, okay, well, I was going to accept that I wasn't necessarily doing myself any favours in terms of growing to be a monster YouTube megastar, which obviously was the whole point of doing it. Yeah. Otherwise, why bother? I was just going to have to go the slow lane and feel sort of somehow morally happy that I was making the right choice while going down to glorious defeat. So that's my unique selling point, I guess.
Do you not feel, though, that by taking that route probably promotes longevity in some aspects, rather than being a flash in the pan?
We cling to these possibilities as justification, yeah. All sorts of wishful thinking things that I can grasp like lead balloons as they pass before my eyes. I mean, look, to be fair, I think that it's one of these things that once you start to get a certain momentum, it will gain its own speed. It's just that some of the things that are there to enable early pushes don't necessarily work for you. But certainly, I have been building an audience gradually, and the people who are attracted to the content are people who are in the spirit of the kind of things that I'm interested in. So, they are a quality audience for me, and building that rather than just getting lots of massive exposure to people who are not really that interested, but sort of come for the drama, ultimately it's more satisfying, I guess.
Mm. Last time you came on, I think it was back in early June, and if I remember correctly, you had just had your first video demonetized.
Quite possibly, yes.
Yeah.
There's been a few more since those.
That's what I was going to ask you. Like, how have things panned out over the last nearly 12 months as far as censorship and other things going?
Not too bad. I mean, the thing is, because I deal with topics that are often sensitive, albeit from a incredibly, some would say, boringly sensible standpoint, YouTube, it will trip all sorts of tripwires for YouTube, because these are subjects about which it is rather sensitive, because after all, there are a bunch of people sticking some mildly dubious and often extremely dubious content about those subjects. Well, absolutely. So, and some of the things that I've done, I never know if they're going to fit that category or not, because I might think that they're sensible, but if I review a book that Amazon has decided is so radical it won't sell it, even though, as far as I can see, it's a perfectly sensible book, and I talk about the subjects that it covers, and I promote some of the arguments that it makes, I've no idea what YouTube is going to make of that. Well, so far it's generally demonetized on first sight. The algorithm says, oh, we're a bit worried about this. I then appeal, and then a human being or something vaguely resembling one looks at it and then restores it. That's the usual thing. By which time most of your audience have already viewed it, so you've lost most of the income anyway. But it wasn't that YouTube, punished you deliberately and purposely for transgressing. It's just that you're walking a fine line, and by default it plays safe. What is happening at the moment is that the channel's being choked for traffic. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm an anti-conspiracy theorist in many ways. That said, these platforms do have policies that around content, and it was either a tweak to the algorithm that did not favour the content that I'm producing, which had no interest in me whatsoever. It was just a tweak to the algorithm, and I was one of the ones that lost out from it. Because about 5 or 6 well-performing videos, evergreen videos that were just doing well, they all just plummeted all at once. Right. From 600 views an hour, it went down to about 30 views per hour, just almost overnight. Wow. So it's either a tweak to the algorithm, or they've put me into a shadow box, a naughty corner that just says, well, we're not going to do anything dramatic like kick this person off, but let's just not promote this stuff. We'll just keep it in its box. I don't know which of those, or if there's a third option, but that's been happening for the last month or two. So slightly irksome, but there you go.
Have you had any other contact with any other YouTubers who maybe have experienced the same thing?
Not directly. I've been aware of one or two of the generally it happens to people when they've gotten bigger than I am. Right. And it becomes a much bigger deal, and they get loads of people asking questions, and it goes higher up and all that kind of stuff. In terms of those of us who are not big enough to have clout, exactly how this sort of thing plays out and how it works, I'm not aware of that really. My basic philosophy is that you keep on going. Keep trying to do good content, and if it's going to be a word of mouth and other platforms that make you grow, so be it. But my basic suspicion is that it will magically resolve itself at some point.
Yeah, it'd be good to at least know if you're actually being targeted, or whether this is a tweak, like you said, a tweak to the general algorithm, which is just affecting certain content. On the whole, that's what you really would like to know, isn't it?
Because my videos are categorized by default as news and politics. And the thing is that when it comes to news and politics, YouTube has active processes that favor the established news agencies, the BBCs and the MSNBCs and so on and so on. Well, that's been the case for some time, and that wasn't necessarily stopping the growth of the channel. It was getting 100 new subscribers a day and the viewer figures that I mentioned before. And that didn't change when suddenly it changed, and suddenly there's no growth whatsoever in subscribers, and the channel's being choked. But it might be something related to that. It might be that they've changed it so that news and politics things are now, really heavily only favouring. And maybe I should try doing a few videos that aren't categorised that, and just try some things and see what works. But at the end of the day, I'd rather just focus on the content, and the people that like it will talk about it, and it will grow in its own time. And, I'll just have to wait another year before making the first million. So, just another year. It's been quite a few years already, so what's another one?
You mentioned other platforms. We've recently had to start an Odysee account because one of our videos got taken off without...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What was your video about that got taken off?
Demon sperm.
Oh, well, yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
You can't expect YouTube to be putting up with demon sperm flying around its platform.
We had demonologist Nathaniel Gillis on talking about demon sperm. I don't think it'll be anything to do with Matt suggesting that Prince Philip was killed by the vaccine.
Right. Well, it's a close run thing between that and demon sperm, I suppose.
It was a joke.
It was a joke.
If the algorithm actually listened to the content rather than sort of just screening it, then yeah, if it was a human, then maybe they would have sort of made a different decision.
Well, we had an email today saying that it had been reviewed on appeal, and it had a close look at it. And obviously, they didn't get your joke, Matt, because
really, it was confirmed. Well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, when they say it's looked at by a human being, I'm never quite sure how close you have to get to categorise for that, because for one that I had that was not renewed on appeal was one I did on Bill Gates some time ago. And when I looked at the details of it, it said, well, human beings looked at this and it's confirmed as bad. And I was thinking, well, this is bonkers, because that video was actually an excerpt of another video that didn't get demonetized at all. So I looked more closely at what they said about it. And they said that it had been demonetized because of their rule against pranks. Violent, jokey, prank kind of content. And I was thinking, sorry, was the person on drugs who looks at this? Because I have never done anything with pranks in them. So maybe they just hit the wrong button or something, and they really meant to hit the subversive content button. I don't know. But that was obviously a mistake. But of course, once it's been reviewed, then that's that. So
what was that clip that we played about the person in charge of censoring stuff?
It was the CEO, Catherine Wojcicki.
Oh yeah, and did she win an award for free speech?
Freedom of Expression Award a couple of weeks ago.
In speech, she took down. She said that she mentioned that she took down 9 million videos a quarter or something like that. Yeah. So, wow. I mean, if 9 million videos are taken off, then I'm not really sure that they have the staff. I know it's a huge corporation to individually check every video. Do you think
9 million?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Not everybody's going to appeal a video being taken down, though, are they? But do you know what I mean?
Some of those, I suspect, will be that they took channels down.
Right. Okay.
And so hundreds of videos associated with a channel all disappeared at once. Yeah, there's several channels that I occasionally watch where they've had several strikes. And if you get the third strike, then that's it. Your channel's gone. Mm-hmm. And some of those channels had, many hundreds of videos on. So I can imagine it gets bulked up with those kind of hits.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know a few people in the sort of alternative media community who've just had the channel wiped and had to start again. And luckily, if they have a decent following on Twitter or something, they can sort of get a leg up with the new channel. But I just wonder if there's a future in this, because going back to Odysee, it seems that there is no censorship there. There's no ads from what I can tell. And I think when the Android, there's already an Apple app, but when the Android app comes out, I might see myself migrating over there permanently.
Well, of course, the challenge is that what YouTube offers is a system that is very well designed to promote content. So if you want to grow a channel, which is obviously mine was doing up until a month and a half ago, and you can see the difference. So my channel was growing by 100 subscribers a day before it then suddenly got hit by this digital COVID that meant it's been laid up in bed ever since. And that's the difference. With YouTube working for the channel, I was getting 100 new subscribers a day. With it ignoring the channel and doing nothing to promote it whatsoever, as far as I can tell, it's getting zero new, more or less zero new subscribers, effectively zero. So that's the difference. Now, Odysee is great. So I set it up as well. I think following your recommendation, actually, I think you posted in the comments of one of my videos and recommended it. And I had a look, and the thing that appeals is obviously it automatically copies over. So you upload something to YouTube, but it automatically then appears on Odysee. So it's effortless in that regard. But of course, it doesn't promote content. So the views there are minimal. And if you want to reach an audience, then, of course, the big platforms, that's what they do.
There is an angle, with the cryptocurrency with Odysee, where by using the platform or charging microtransactions of cryptocurrency to gain the library coins, you can then invest, if you like, those tokens in your content, and it improves the what would they call it? There's something score. The I don't know the name. Sort of, it's help me out. No,
I can't remember.
No, it's your like legitimacy of the channel. So there is a way of sort of making your content look more favourable to Odysee by using the currency that is on the platform. But again, I think it's probably a slow burn.
Well, yeah, I guess it is. And the key thing is, where does the audience currently go that hasn't discovered you yet? Yeah. And Odysee may grow as a platform, but ultimately the problem with these alternative platforms is that you end up going there when you've been chucked off the other one. Whereas if you're just a viewer, you go to where you see the most content, and that's the big platforms. So although certain content creators might take a percentage of their viewers with them, and it's only ever a minority as far as I can see, because there's one or two that have got very loyal user bases that got semi-thrown off, and they set up possibly not on Odysee, but on Rumble, I think.
Yeah.
And they only took they pushed it hard, and I think they managed to take about 1/10 of their audience with them. So you might be able to take a few of them with you, but ultimately the attraction of the platforms is that it's a route. If it's working properly, it's a route to a larger audience. And, obviously that has its attractions. It's kind of one of the things that makes producing content worthwhile, because a lot of work goes into it. So, of course you want it to have the biggest audience you can get. But if the price of that is you're not allowed to talk about some pretty mainstream questions about, pandemics that are raging through the world, and everyone's talking about them, and yet suddenly people are going to get twitchy about exactly what you're allowed to say about them, then obviously you then have to decide how much you're willing to self-censor and what sort of risk you're prepared to take in being cut off from the access that platform gives you. And that is a difficult thing. I mean, at the moment I'm holding the line that I don't self-censor, and I haven't gone into such egregious territory that I've been back to the wall and had to make a really hard decision. But I'm fascinated by the things that are the most problematic, so it's going to happen.
I think the problem is that the lines are getting narrower and narrower in what's acceptable on these platforms as well. And one of the YouTubers I follow is Dr. John Campbell, I think it is. He's a retired doctor, and it's a big channel. It's just shy of 1 million subs, and he does a 30-minute update every day on the latest his interpretation of the coronavirus data and whatnot. And he mentioned on one of his most recent videos that one of his interviews had been banned on Facebook, and he's incredibly mainstream. I mean, pro-mask, pro-lockdown, vaccinate the children, nothing controversial. He even said in one of his videos, and I clipped it, I can't say this because it goes against WHO guidelines or something.
Oh, for goodness sake. I mean, since when did the pronouncements of large bureaucratic organisations dictate what you're allowed to say in a public space? I mean,
Mallen, the WHO is omnipotent, infallible.
Well, yes, well, it's it would be more convincing if it didn't keep changing its own mind about what it thinks about the world. And and there are interesting. So I did a video 6 months ago, I'm sure that's wrong, I don't know if it was 4 months ago or 8 months ago, about the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lab leak hypothesis, because there's a great deal of persuasive, persuasive evidence, no proof, but persuasive evidence, and a paucity of evidence that supports the supposed mainstream, most likely explanation, which is that, it transferred from a bat via an animal or directly to a human being. There are a number of things pushing against that, but there is also no supporting evidence. They can't find the intermediary that you would expect to be able to find. It didn't go straight from a bat to a human because it was so well adapted for humans by the time it kicked off. So it either went to a third animal, or it went into a human and then quietly festered away in a way that didn't attract attention, which seemed highly unlikely, but it's another possibility. Or it was developed, it was taken from a bat into the laboratory, and gain of research work was done on the natural virus to the point where it became extremely well adapted, and then somebody had a bad day at the office and they've been covering up ever since. And there's lots of bleeding obvious rationale for that, as well as some rather more sophisticated rationale for it. But 8 months ago or 6 months ago, whenever it was, it felt like a dangerous thing to talk about because Donald Trump had posited that it had come from the lab in Wuhan. So, of course, we knew that only crazy conspiracists would ever go there. But, of course, that isn't a very good reason because look, whatever you think about Trump, even a broken clock is right twice a day, right? So, he heard somebody say something and he repeated it in a slightly garbled way. Well, the thing that he heard can still be right. So anyway, now I think it is slowly nudging more into the mainstream discourse since the WHO had its ridiculous expedition into China, where they held a press conference before they'd even left the country saying, well, we've looked at all this sort of stuff and we haven't found an awful lot. We don't really know very much more than we did, except we do know that it's very unlikely it came from a laboratory. And you think, hey, what? And he was, well, why? And they said, oh, well, we asked them lots of questions and they seemed, reasonably on board. What on earth are you talking about? So that was so odd that you couldn't keep that out of the mainstream narratives. And lots of articles started appearing saying, this seems a bit odd. And then, of course, the Director General of the WHO himself then stands up and says, no, nothing's off the table yet.
Yeah, and there was some interesting conflicts of interest with the team as well. I think the guy leading the team, actually.
Well, no, it's slightly complicated because there were two different inquiries. The WHO one was led by someone whose name I forget, but a member of the team is the person you're thinking of, who had been involved with exactly the research that they were trying not to investigate in the Wuhan laboratory. In
the actual lab as well. He was directly involved with the Wuhan
That's
lab.
Right, absolutely. And he was then leading the other inquiry as well. So that was why it's slightly confusing who was leading what. But he should never have been anywhere near it. And a number of epidemiologists, when they heard the news that he was involved, were like, that's crazy, that's bonkers. And yet, you then produce a video that looks in a very sober and sensible way at what evidence there is and what questions there are and which epidemiologists are arguing about which and what evidence has come up, and you don't know whether YouTube is going to say, well, hang on a moment, because WHO doesn't think that, so you're off, mate. Yeah. And it's so this kind of censorship question, it isn't just about what's allowed and what isn't. It's that when the rules are not clear, the urge to self-censor because you're not quite sure where you are vis-a-vis the rules is overwhelming. And there's loads of people, in the same way as loads of people won't say what they think because of political correctness and the woke phenomenon. Equally, now, if you're on a platform like YouTube and Facebook and so on, there's a whole bunch of people self-censoring because they don't want to be thrown off.
Yeah.
It's insidious.
One of the other dangers, it occurs to me, is maybe things being censored retrospectively. So, 5 years from now, if the terms and conditions change and then all of a sudden you've made all this content and the rules change, what's to stop them just taking it all down?
Yes. And, there's certainly one or two I've seen who have had hits against them for videos that they'd uploaded 6 months previously or something. So, at the end of the day, people will say, well, these are private companies and they can do whatever they want and so on and so on, which of course is true. But I think we're now getting to the stage where we're realizing that that's not good enough, because this is the public space now. Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, they are the public space. And so it's not good enough. And of course, this is what we've been discussing with Facebook, with their very esteemed panel of outside experts to rule on mighty matters that are too big for mere mortals like Mark Zuckerberg, such as whether Donald Trump should be on Facebook or not. And of course, they've looked at that and then they batted it back and said, we don't know. It's up to you, mate. So that was well worth the money they're getting paid, I expect.
I mean, do you think that the big tech companies would prefer to be treated like a utility and regulated by the state?
They would prefer that the controversy doesn't go anywhere near them.
Because of advertising.
They don't want it. They don't. You see, some people think that YouTube and Facebook are enforcing an ideology and they're seeking out people who think like them because they're ideologically of the left or whatever, whichever side they think they're on. I don't think that's the case at all. I think they just want to be left alone to make shed loads of money. And the problem is that the best way to make shed loads of money is to have advertising run against all sorts of things. And the trouble is that if your advertising runs against certain things, then a whole bunch of people complain and they attack you, and it appears on the front page of the Times newspaper, which is one of the ones that tends to go after YouTube and Facebook on these sorts of things. So then they are into this world of pain where they want to tread the line as close to the line as they can, because that will be profitable, but they don't want to be dragged over the line by politicians. But of course, the politicians are fighting like cats in a bag, largely because Trump so effectively weaponized Twitter and weaponized social media. So they can't anymore ignore the fact that they are a campaign vehicle for politicians, which means they can't ignore the whole crux of the debate around what is or isn't a public space and how should or should it not be regulated.
I do wonder if there is a political bias, a sort of left-wing Silicon Valley mentality. I'm just thinking back to the Hunter Biden thing right before the election, when that story was shut down.
The election was a special moment, let's put it that way, because I think Facebook and Twitter had been hit so hard in 2016 for what people said was their responsibility in Trump getting elected in the first place. And I don't think it's a question of left or right. I think Trump was such a different character. This was a different sort of a political moment. They were all pretty horrified to think that, not that they had been a channel through which it went, but that maybe they were responsible. That if it wasn't for them, it would not have happened. And that was something that a lot of people found very difficult to cope with. So in that sense, yes, it was political. And then when Trump was going again, and of course, it's always a very dirty campaign anyway in the United States at the best of times. But of course, 2020 was even more special in many ways. I think they just decided that whatever happened, they didn't want to have that on their charge sheet again after this election. And so they did do some extraordinarily partisan things. Yeah. I mean, the mainstream media, the CNNs and the MSNBCs and so on, and social media were just astonishing in that election. I mean, I didn't have a dog in the fight. I thought both of the main candidates were appalling. I didn't understand how the biggest democracy in the world, actually, well, no, the oldest democracy in the world, let's call it that. India is bigger, technically. How it could have dredged up these two candidates to be, the top of the pile for who was going to run the country. It just seemed to me to be utterly ridiculous. So I didn't really have that much of a dog in the fight. And yet it was just horrifying to see how biased the coverage was. And of course, as you say, with the Hunter Biden stuff, which was it was a crappy campaign tactic.
From Giuliani.
Even if there was a story in it, Rudy Giuliani was sitting on it until the tactical right moment where they were trying to then inject it into the news press. I mean, of course, it was totally artificial in that regards. And I would have been asking serious questions of my conscience as a journalist, suddenly seeing that. But ultimately, the way they handled it was outrageously biased. And that, sadly, is the nature of the beast there at the moment. Yeah. Whether that remains the case for social media, though, I'm not sure. Because I think ultimately they're aware that both the Democrats and the Republicans could turn around to bite them at any time. And both of them show an appetite for doing it. So I think at the moment they're more on risk aversion than they are on batting for one side.
There was an interesting story out of India. I think it was last week we covered it, the week before, about the Resign Modi hashtag.
Yes.
Did you hear about that being pulled off Facebook?
Yes. Well, of course, India's government has been very actively trying to censor the internet. And this is, I think, the main challenge we have. We have to do some things about climate change, and it's all very important and so on. But I think the biggest challenge facing us in the short term is the growing temptation for us to pretend to be China.
It's a bit late for that.
Well, we've all had a taste of what this feels like. We all pretended to be China when it came to locking up our societies. We didn't have to do that. And there was nothing, if you look back to the previous pandemics of time gone by, there was nothing automatic that said that we had to do exactly what we did. Behaviour change happens generally quite naturally when there's a dangerous pandemic around. Governments can facilitate and support that without having to tell people whether or not you should be eating a bloody Scotch egg. I mean, for God's sake. Anyway, so you look at India and China are rivals. They are not in a happy coexisting space at the moment. But certainly India is looking with interest to some of the Chinese tools of control. And Modi has certainly tried to use some of those to try to suppress information about how bad the pandemic has been there over recent weeks. Yeah. Because, of course, we're seeing these figures. And it's driving me crazy a little bit because there are some people who I respected quite a bit when all this kicked off for, critical voices, lockdown critical voices and so on, who I think have sort of, as the vaccines have come in and it's all started working, they've wanted to stay in the critical lane and they've pushed themselves further and further into an extreme position to do so. And I understand the momentum that pushes you to do that, because you're always trying to feed your audience what they want, and you can end up allowing your audience to push you into a corner if you're not careful. I regularly piss my audience off, so it's not a problem for me, which may be why my channel's not growing, but anyway, that's another thing. However, some of those people have started saying, oh, well, you look at the figures for India and, they're nowhere near, this is all just fake. It's all just things that are being fed us to keep us locked down and to keep us scared because of what's happening in India. And you've got to say, well, look, no, I'm sorry. You had some good arguments for some of this earlier stuff, but this is a really bad argument because India is not giving you reliable data. There are way more deaths that are going on there than they are admitting to. And we've seen the coverage of this in various places places, not just in the ones that we're used to treating with several pinches of salt. I'm sorry, if the government says, there's only been 25 deaths in this village, but, the crematorium has actually burned 75 people today, and that's just one of 3, you start to say, well, the data is junk. So we know that countries where this has run rampant go through a certain course, and we also know that India has slums with many, many people totally unable and not really culturally interested in socially distancing. So you should expect it to be at least as bad there as it's been anywhere else.
Well, presumably worse because of the lack of provision. It's still a developing country, isn't it?
Well, this is the thing, because they've been running out of oxygen. So people go to hospital. In the UK, people went to hospital. They got oxygen if they needed oxygen. Some of them died anyway, and many of them recovered because they got the oxygen when they needed it. Well, India has been turning away more people from hospitals than it's been taking in over the last few days, by all accounts, by many different sources. Social media, people begging for, all the people queuing up to get cylinders of oxygen because they're treating their people at home. Why are so many people getting oxygen? Because people are having to try and get through this at home. So all of the signs are there that, the stories we're reading are true. All the social media feeds and the hashtags and Modi has been prosecuting people for tweeting that they need oxygen. Because all they did, I think they stopped doing that now. They've given up on that side of it. But for a while, they were really trying to suppress any suggestion that the government wasn't majestically coping with all of this. And you just got to ask yourself, well, how close are we to the position where we could drift into the bad habits that we've said that we were only doing temporarily for the purposes of a pandemic over the last year or two? It's not so I think we're going to go full Stalin overnight, but once you've crossed a line, it's a lot easier to cross the line again. Yeah. And I was listening to Niall Ferguson. That's Niall Ferguson, not Neil Ferguson. Niall Ferguson, the historian who's just published a new book about doom and major incidents through history, pandemics and major accidents and things, and how people dealt with them and attitudes to them and all of this sort of thing. And, and he was sounding the alarm that said, well, what we have done, and if you look through history of how this can work out, you often become like the enemy you've defeated. And he says, and one of the things that we're doing right now is we're having this conflict with China, and there was some momentum pushing us to become like them, to cope with them. And that is, let's not get silly about it. Let's not get, the elites are just doing this and they're going to keep us locked down forever. I mean, all those things are nonsense. But there is a real momentum that we should be paying careful attention to.
Absolutely. And our whole democratic system is based on convention. If you listen to some of the stuff Lord Sumption's been saying, and once those conventions have been broken, there's no way back. The only possible way back would be maybe if there was some sort of public inquiry and the overwhelming result of that was that this was a huge mistake. If it is, I'm not saying it is, but once that convention, that line, like you said, has been crossed, it seems pretty difficult to roll it back.
I think what would tend to roll it back in the absence of other pressures would be that once you've gone too far, there's a backlash. And by and large, in the UK, we have a pretty solid, sensible centre that likes competence and dislikes ideology. You can't wholly rely on it day to day, but sooner or later it kicks back in and says, oh, we think this has gone a bit too far, let's bring it back to the centre. Now, I think the UK's got that more solidly than the US has, and that's quite important because the US isn't a trivial, bystander that we don't need to worry about. But nevertheless, I do think that the core of that is there. If all things are equal, but all things are not equal, because we do have this challenge of China and we do have a challenge also of Russia. Both of them have gotten a very effective modus operandi, which is that they've learned how to disrupt democracies. They've learned how to feed in the mischievous fake news, how to stir up, how to polarize, how to feed existing polarization. They don't necessarily create the polarization, but they can certainly stir it around and make it worse. And they've learned how to do that very effectively. And we are totally susceptible to that. You know, we will fall for that every single time, as far as I can see. You know, I've done videos debunking some of the conspiracist things that are out there that are very, very easily disproven, and yet people are so passionately taken up with the polarization aspect that they will ignore any facts, any evidence, in order to cling on to their assumption that the other side are up to something. You know, if you are in a polarized situation, seeing the other side as malicious and up to something is something you want to believe. So any little things that go in there to stir that pot, they will have huge traction. And they know that, and they've weaponized it. They become very sophisticated at it. And so we can't ignore the fact that that is one of the things you're having to deal with at the same time as trying to draw back your own government or your own. It's not even the government, it's the instincts of the people. You know, the people desperately wanted to be locked down because they were scared.
Yeah, but this is where the messaging comes in, though. You know, then the you know, what was the no, it went from this will be over from Easter. No, 3 weeks to flatten the curve. It'll be over by Easter. Hands, face, space. Save lives, protect the NHS. We get this, you know, people. I mean, I don't watch the TV or anything, but people who are bombarded with this messaging every waking moment of their life, it's gonna have an effect on them and their perception.
Yes. But, you know, I think part of the challenge is that a significant body of the public have been very willing recipients of the message. We do live in a risk-averse society. You know, we fought world wars. That was a very long time ago. Very few of us are still alive who have any memory of that whatsoever. We have gotten flabby and soft since then. We have been living in a bloody health and safety culture that has made us terrified of our own shadows, by and large. And so, yeah, actually, what we've discovered is that we are all scared of scary things, and we will happily be locked down by the government. And so what do we do with that information? What does the government do with that information? Boris Johnson isn't a natural authoritarian. He's a libertarian at heart. But, you know, he was accused of killing thousands of people by the likes of Piers Morgan early on. So he's also scared. He's also risk-averse. And so if the public wants to be locked down, he'll give it to them good and hard. It was something Boris is known to do. Sorry, I can't believe I said that. But, you know, so where do we go with all of this, particularly when there are malevolent forces stirring it up, trying to make it as bad as possible? And I don't think any of us know the answer to that.
One of the sort of the next steps in the mission creep of moving towards maybe a more Chinese system, which seems obvious to me, is the vaccine passport system, particularly if it's implemented domestically. And I'm waiting to see what Michael Gove comes out with his report. I think it's due next week or very soon. What's your view on that, on the vaccine passporting system, and what are the chances of something being implemented?
Well, I think it's likely something will be implemented, but I mean, this was done in Israel. Israel, of course, is slightly ahead of us in terms of vaccinating the population. It was introduced in Israel and almost immediately became redundant because it wasn't needed, and the people who were then supposed to enforce it, the restaurant owners and the event holders, they didn't bother, and the police didn't bother to enforce it, and it just wasn't an issue. Because ultimately, the main purpose for it was to provide an incentive to those who didn't much fancy getting vaccinated. you know, fine. You don't want to get vaccinated, we're not going to force you. But if you want to go to that concert, you know, if you want to go into that restaurant, you know, if you want to regain the sex, drugs and rock and roll lifestyle, then you're going to need a passport. And so in that situation, you know, that is the main argument for it as far as government's concerned. Now, that's going to play more, I think, in Europe, where they have had populations that were more naturally vaccine hesitant than the UK, I think, has proven to be. And then some of whose politicians went out of their way, bizarrely, for what seemed to be very short-term ridiculous political reasons, to actually stir up that vaccine hesitancy in what seemed to be an anti-Brexit drive. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. They may well be pushing hard on that, and that may then will overlap onto us, because for some reason the only thing the Brits are worried about on all of this is where they're going to go for their holiday, which I'm not entirely sure I get how desperately crucial that has become in recent years. But that seems to be the only thing we care about out of all of this.
Well, the Falkland Islands is pretty chilly this time of year, if you want to go there.
Well, yeah. If you like penguins or whatever it is they've got out there, that's good. Who doesn't like penguins? Come on. I mean, you know. So, yeah, the Falklands, the Arctic, I think, a few other, you know, prime locations. And then Portugal. And Portugal would be a lovely place to visit any other time than the next 6 months, because it's just going to be rammed with the most obnoxious people who couldn't care less. And you know, I hope none of the three of you are going to Portugal. And if you are, I didn't mean you. Okay, but, yeah.
You're going, aren't you, Amish Matt?
Yeah, I'm going in half term summer.
Yeah, you'll be there, bright red, with your your St. George's flag wrapped round you.
Well, when you've been, then you can tell me whether or not some of the other people there didn't fit my description. That's all.
I don't think you can tell people if they look at the same as you, though. That's the thing, isn't it?
True. Yeah. Oh dear.
I was just taking it back to Lord Sumption and the identity cards. He mentioned, didn't he, something about after the Second World War that there was a similar thing where they enforced identity cards.
Yes.
Eventually, sort of like 5 or 6 years. I think he said something along the lines of about 5 or 6 years after the war, there was a case of someone ripping up their identity card and then being arrested or reported, and it being thrown out. It was
ration cards, I think, wasn't it?
Well, there was. So I don't know if it's the same case. There was a case a few years after the war where I think the police asked to see somebody's papers, to see their identification, and they refused. And then that went to court, and the judges then threw that out on the basis that this was wartime legislation. It was being used, it was emergency legislation for the war, and it was being used years later, and that simply wasn't how it should be. So I don't know if that's the same case that he's referring to there, but that's a very famous, and it's just it's a classic one that people are using to illustrate what has been seen numerous times, which is that emergency powers are slow to be handed back. And sometimes they're not at all, and sometimes they are only reluctantly and late. And that's not a UK thing. That is a very standard thing of governments worldwide, whatever their political complexion, except for the total totalitarians, because they didn't need to have emergency powers in the first place. So that's an absolutely valid point. Now, I don't think vaccine passports is the issue with that. I can understand why libertarians will focus on that in the same way some of them are focused on masks. I think it's a bit stupid. I think putting a bit of cloth over your face is not the end of the bloody world. However, I understand why for some people it's the first frontier that they see in front of them, and it becomes very personal to them. And the vaccine passports is the next one in line. I just don't think it's going to be that important. within the UK, because I think the vast majority of people have been vaccinated. We're seeing it in terms of the numbers of deaths have gone right down. You know, now it's only the healthy 20, 30-year-olds who are going to be catching it. They're going to be getting vaccinated, many of them. I just don't think it's going to be an issue, therefore, because the motivation to have the vaccine passport, apart from going on your holidays, isn't going to be that big a thing day to day. I think the bigger issues are going to be the things that happen a little bit less in full view. You know, we have big environmental problems. Why do people go on about plastic straws so much? You know, plastic straws are bugger all to do with our environmental problems, really. They go on about them because they're immediately in front of them. Yeah. And I think it's going to be the same with this. I think the rules that were brought in that get handed back, you know, don't get handed back or get handed back very reluctantly. The ones that will get handed back quickest are the ones that we care the most about, that are right in front of us. But, you know, it's the ones that are a little bit out of sight, but are actually really quite important, where you really need to be paying attention, I think.
What such as what?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, which in some ways... I mean, there may be 20 answers to that, but the thing that immediately comes to mind dovetails with our previous conversation, because what we've had in terms of content, what you're allowed to say and what you're not, you know, what we have had has been much more intrusiveness about whether or not you're allowed to have a platform, whether or not you get deplatformed or demonetized, whether or not the mainstream media will allow you to you know, be interviewed in any way, shape or form. It used to be that happened with relation to climate deniers. And we can talk about that because, you know, I'm very mainstream on climate change, but I think the whole thing about deplatforming climate deniers is problematic, because how do you define what that covers? And you'll find that what is actually the 97% consensus on climate science and what is actually a whole bunch of outlier stuff and things that campaigners believe to be the science that are actually nowhere near settled, well, there's a whole bunch of grey areas in there. And do those get taken into account when people talk about that? As far as I can see, not very much at all. So again, you can get some very mainstream questions that deserve scrutiny, like Joe Biden's plan, is it any good? You know, I've seen it suggested quite recently that, you know, well, of course, as a journalist, you would expect to be, you know, promoting, you know, Joe Biden's plan and everything, but blah, 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 blah. You think, really? Hang on a moment. Since when did journalists promote, as a point of their duty as a journalist, a politician's policy platform? Weren't they supposed to be holding power to account? But no, because the other side are deniers. You know, we therefore have to line up with this side. Well, okay, that's not a pandemic thing. That is an enforced orthodoxy thing. And I think that there was enough grit in the oyster to kick back against that, but then the pandemic came along, and then suddenly we had this other huge question that affects everybody's lives, where there was suddenly an orthodoxy that must be enforced, and more people got chucked off Twitter or had demonetized videos on YouTube and so on because they were talking about the pandemic than any other subject. Now, what's the next orthodoxy? You know, are we now into this frame of mind that says that there are certain opinions that are dangerous, and therefore responsible journalists and responsible platform owners suppress certain messages? And, you know, the messages might be completely batshit crazy. I mean, you know, maybe, you know, I think David Icke is completely off his head, allegedly. But, you know, should he have been removed from YouTube? I don't think so. I think it's not how you're meant to deal with those sorts of things. You know, the answer to bad speech is more speech and all of that sort of thing. I strongly believe in that. I thought we strongly believed in that. However, The thing that I worry about not handing back is this idea that there is an orthodoxy and there are dangerous ideas, not just wrong ideas, not just ideas of the people who are opposed, the opposing view to me hold, but dangerous ideas that must be suppressed. Well, I'm worried we're not going to be handing that back.
I'm happy to be one of the heretics who gets burned at the stake, because you got to voice different opinions, and it's an important point you raise. This it is analogous. What you're saying, what we were talking about before about the infallible WHO, and if you go against WHO guidance on YouTube, you're opening yourself up for censorship. And the same can be said for, it seems, climate change. And it seems that once we're bored of the pandemic, this is going to be the next big issue that's going to be thrust into the forefront of our consciousnesses again. And I keep hearing this thing: the science is settled. And it just grates on my bones when people say that. That's not the point of it.
No, you see, I understand where it came from. So, I've spent the last 2 years looking at, what are the best arguments against, what are the best arguments on, where are the grey areas, what does the research actually say, what are the scientists themselves, where are they having vigorous debates, and where are they all saying, well, we all agree with this. And when you get down to the core, the essential core, that the world is warming, yes. It is warming because of CO2, because of the increases in CO2, yes, and the increases are happening because of human fossil fuel emissions, yes. There are multiple strains of evidence that support those very, very core building blocks. Now, it's not that all of the rest then is fancy, because the models that have been produced, there are certain things that they are looking at, what will happen with very, very high confidence. But then there's a whole bunch of other stuff we don't know. And that's just the science. Then there's the policy. And this for me is the real danger zone, the real gulf that we're going to fall down, because as far as the campaigners are concerned, there is no difference. If you don't accept their policy proposals, then you are denying the science. And there's a big leap from there to say, yes, there's a problem that we need to be doing something about. What should we do about it? That is the question that is always open for debate. That's what politics is for. What should we do? We all agree that we don't want people to starve to death. We all agree that we think poverty should be reduced. We all agree that basically we want equal opportunities. We all agree on all sorts of things as worthy outcomes. And we fight like cats in a bag about how you achieve that in the right way. And conservatives will say, you set the system up and give people the maximum freedom, and the outcomes will tend to support best outcomes. And people on the left will say that, no, you need to plan your outcomes better because it's not going to happen by accident. And if you do it the other way, there's too many people who fall between the cracks, and there's too many people who become too rich, and all this kind of stuff. Fine, that is the stuff of politics. That is the debate we need to be having. I worry about people saying, no, we're not allowed to have that debate, because there's only one answer to resolving this question, and it's our answer. And I don't see journalists challenging that. Nowhere near to the degree. I see activist journalists in the BBC and in many other outlets, not just The Guardian, in all of these mainstream outlets, for whom questioning the policy is not what you should be doing. I'm about to do a video that will go live tomorrow from when we're talking for this.
It's live now. It's live now.
Well, live now. Okay, so going live tomorrow. Which looks at a coalition of a lot of mainstream outlets that came together to come up with 10 rules of how you should be reporting on climate change. And it's aimed at mainstream journalists, and lots have signed up to it. Quite a few others haven't, but, the pressure is this is the orthodoxy of what you should be doing. And it includes, do not ridicule climate activism. And I'm sorry, but climate activists are not scientists. Climate activists do dumb things just the same as the rest of us do. And when they do, they should be held to account and sometimes even ridiculed. Because why not? Why would you get a free pass? You know, just because you say that you're doing something for the right reason. Well, we all say that. Yeah. You know, nobody says, aha, I'm out being nefarious today. I'm evil. No, of course not. We all say we're doing the right thing. Most of us believe we're doing the right thing, even when demonstrably we're doing something utterly stupid and counterproductive. You know, the Extinction Rebellion people who stopped commuters from getting on the tube train at Canning Town, they arguably were doing an extremely stupid thing. You know, people made that case. Now, you can defend that case, you know, and that's fine. It's worthy of debate, and that's all I'm saying. You know, nobody gets a free pass where you say you're not allowed to criticise these people. And yet there it was in the guidance. Not just don't criticise the science, that was in as well. Highly problematic, because science is a process of arguing. You know, it's a process of observing and collecting evidence, and then having a very, very critical scrutiny of the evidence and trying to disprove it. It's a process. It's not an answer. People don't get it.
And one of the big changes I noticed is the change in terminology. So we had the change to climate emergency, for example, in all the mainstream media outlets being filtered in.
Yes.
In the same way as climate change. I mean, it used to be global warming, and now it's climate change.
Well,
messaging changes.
Those are two different things. So the climate change, global warming thing has been played up a bit by the skeptics, and that doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny quite as much, because climate change and global warming have been used by the scientific community since 1896.
But not in the media, though, in the reporting.
Well, this is the thing. So in terms of the scientific discourse, they have a specific meaning. They can often be used interchangeably in terms of some of the modern discourse, but they weren't switched specifically with a nefarious intent. What the skeptics say is they say, oh, well, we got this period where it wasn't warming anymore, so then they changed it from global warming to climate change. That didn't happen. There were a couple of organizations, a couple of UN bodies, US bodies, where they declared that they changed their policy, that they were going to use climate change because people got confused by global warming. The general population, their mainstream audiences, got confused with global warming, and they didn't understand that it also meant, you know, more floods and more hurricanes and these things. They just thought it just meant it got warmer, and they said climate change is less confusing, so we're going to use that. And it was just a couple of agencies.
Even though it's more ambiguous.
Well, yeah, but at least then you know it's ambiguous. You know, climate change, you know, you have to ask a couple more questions to understand it. Whereas if you hear it and you think, oh yeah, well, I just need it a bit warmer, and I like warm weather, so why would I be worried? But that was just a couple of agencies, and the skeptics who said, oh, they did that because it wasn't getting warmer. Well, first of all, it was. And secondly, you know, those agencies were not particularly big mainstream things. They just jumped on it and they turned it into a meme, and it wasn't really valid. However, the climate emergency thing, you know, that actually is exactly what they were alleging then. That's sort of that in practice now, in that, you know, a lot of the media outlets and some of the scientific community, sadly, have been drawn into the idea that this is the language that will win people over. And I just think the scientific community shouldn't be in the business of winning people over. And I understand why they feel they should be, and I understand it's a difficult area. If you are involved as a scientist and you see things that you think, oh my God, society needs to do something about this, treading the line between science and activism, it is a genuine dilemma. I get that, absolutely. But I think you've always got to stay on the side of the science, which means that you don't create a perverse incentive to ignore evidence because you've committed yourself to a campaign position. Yeah. You know, when I look at some of the most activist scientists, like Kevin Anderson, who is the darling of the campaigners, the Extinction Rebellion campaigners, he is one of the doomsayers. He is now, I would say, from what I've seen of his pronouncements, he is now compromised as a scientist because he has established, he's pitched his tent with a very, very strong position. And, you know, in the same way we're talking about some of the lockdown skeptics, you know, some of the people who had solid PhD medical, epidemiological credentials who pitched their tents, you know, in a very, very specific place and then had to defend that place. And you end up cherry picking the evidence. Yeah. Not because you're nefarious, because as human beings, we just naturally do. We notice the evidence that reinforces our prior bias and we manage to miss the evidence that somehow doesn't. And that is a danger. Scientists are aware of it as a danger. I think the more of an activist you become, the more of a danger that becomes. And so I understand it's a really difficult dilemma. You see the evidence and you know that society needs to do something about it. Ultimately, it's not the scientist's job to decide what that should be. Michael Mann, climate scientist, tells everyone that carbon tax is the way. Well, I'm sorry, Michael, that is outside your area of expertise. You have an opinion about it. That's great. You're a citizen. Same as every other citizen, they're going to have their opinions about public policy. You're allowed that. But it's not you as a scientist that has that opinion. You as a scientist can say, you know, well, we've seen this effect in the atmosphere and this means that this is likely to happen here. But when it comes to what should we do about it, you have a voice and it is no more of a voice than any other voice. And the problem is the more of an activist you become, the more sceptical we then have to be about the science. And that's just the nature of it.
Just to bring this sort of full circle, what you're saying there about scientists, individual scientists being fallible, being susceptible to their own psychology and peer pressure and securing funding and maybe the political views, all the more reason not to be shutting down opposing voices, like you were saying before, on the whole range of issues. I think that's important to underline.
No, I think that's right. I think democracy is a system that only works because it enables challenge. Yeah. And that is the whole point of it. And science only works as a process because it welcomes challenge. You know, most science, and you know, there's different flavors of this. So some of the skeptics will say that people are always trying to shut them down, and to some extent, what you can't see at first glance is the difference between a proposition that has no scientific credibility and so isn't published in peer-reviewed journals because it has no credibility, and those where you have an orthodoxy that's simply being maintained by, you know, a boys' club that are just trying to keep opposing ideas out. Yeah. You know, it's very hard to tell the difference from the outside between those two. And the skeptics will always say, well, you know, they're trying to keep us out. I have looked at a lot of the skeptic arguments with an open mind, trying to see, okay, what are the best arguments? And, you know, one or two of them were really quite good arguments. And an awful lot of them are dross. And sometimes very learned people who were great physicists come into this field and attach themselves to dross, and people say, no, yeah, these are great scientists, they're learned people, so we must be taking their word seriously. How can that be? Well, there is a phenomenon that has actually been observed outside of the climate issue, because in the climate issue it all gets politicized, but outside of there's also been a phenomenon where, you know, great physicists will then wander into somebody else's territory and assume that it's easy, and assume that, you know, the various people who are practitioners in it are somehow drongos. And I was reading this, you know, somebody put it this way only the other day, about this known phenomenon about very, very smart people who move outside of their area of specialism and assume that they're still smarter than everyone that they then deal with. Yeah. And it's a trap that you can get into. So it doesn't mean to say that they must be wrong, but it does mean the fact that they're learners in one field doesn't automatically transfer into another field. And this is one of the challenges, because some of the skeptic arguments are dross. They are nonsensical. If you look at any of the streams of evidence, they don't go anywhere near to explaining. So, for instance, one of the reasons why we think that the greenhouse gas is creating global warming is the phenomenon whereby the troposphere, the lower atmosphere, is warming, but the stratosphere, which is the next layer up, is cooling, which is what you expect if the heat is being reflected back down because of CO2. That's a very layman's term description of what's happening. But the heat isn't getting up to the stratosphere, so you expect that to be cooling as the troposphere is warming. Whereas any version that says, oh, well, it's happening because we're getting more solar radiation, well, that wouldn't work that way. You would get warming in both layers rather than just the bottom layer. So it's things like that, where the observations that you can see that aren't disputed, that fit the what we know about the greenhouse gas theory of climatic change, and demonstrably don't fit some of these alternative explanations that people come up with. Now, that's fine, but you wouldn't expect peer-reviewed journals to then start publishing papers that ignore observed evidence and just put stuff forward that is demonstrably known by the community to have no validity. Now, how can you tell the difference between that and a clique that's formed around an orthodoxy where they're protecting their own self-interest? And of course, from the outside, it's quite hard to do. That said, the way that science is done does tend to favour, if you've got a really strong piece of evidence to upset the orthodoxy, there's fame and riches and Nobel Prizes down that route. So, some of the skeptics who say, they're all in it together, they're all defending their grants. You mentioned grants. It's all about the grant funding. Well, actually, the incentives don't really work that way, because in every other field where it's not politicised, they fight like cats in a bag over these things, and they try to disprove theories all the time because that's where the fame lies, if you can do that. Yeah, so it's a little bit more complicated than some would like to make it out. However, any community, scientific community, is the same as any other, of course, is full of imperfect human beings who do some things for the right reasons and get unintended consequences, sometimes do things for perverse incentives and do it for the wrong reasons, and we all just get along as well as we possibly can and try to make sense out of it.
Yeah. Well, Mallen, we've blown over an hour already. I don't know where the time's gone.
Blimey.
We're going to have to wrap up again.
Mostly me waffling on like a windbag, I suspect. But
no, it's very interesting, and it's good to talk to you again. The links will be in the description, Eavesdroppers. Please check out Mallen's channel on YouTube and Odysee. Are you on any other platforms other than them too?
Those are the two reliable ones. I have a Facebook page where at the moment I simply post content that appears on the YouTube channel. I do have ambitions to do more there, but I have ambitions to do 20 things, so 19 of those are not going to happen. Those are the main ones. There's the website, mallenbaker.net. You can sign up to the emails, which have been in abeyance for the last couple of months, but they will be coming back. And when the deplatforming is going on, then that is the most reliable place, because you will continue to hear from me regardless of what happens anywhere else.
Absolutely. Well, just hang on the line for us for 2 minutes while we play ourselves out. Good to talk to you again, Mallen, and links will be in the description, and we'll catch you on the flip side. Don't touch that dial. Cheers. Right then, we're back.
The dwarf, the cripple, and the mother of madness.
That was our chat with the legend. That is Mallen Baker.
Yeah. Ultimate legend, Mallen Lineker.
Easy for you to say.
Mallen Lineker.
Yes, don't forget to check out the links in the description for Mallen's content.
They're really good. I enjoy